The scorching Texas sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape of Pearsall, a small town that seemed frozen in time. It was a September afternoon, and the heat still lingered in the air like a persistent ghost of summer refusing to depart. David Mitchell, an investigative journalist for the San Antonio Express-News, drove his Ford pickup along the dusty road, following a tip he'd received from a local resident about a potentially interesting story. "There's a famous guy who's been showing up at the old church at the end of Elm Street," Elena Rodriguez had said, the owner of the town's only cafe, while serving him coffee that morning. "Nobody knows why he comes, but Sarah Williams from the flower shop swears she saw George Strait himself walking around that place last week." David had initially dismissed the claim. George Strait, the king of country music, had no known connections to this remote corner of Texas, far from his usual haunts in San Antonio or his ranch in Encinal. But Eleanor's certainty, combined with similar reports from two other locals, had piqued his journalistic curiosity enough to warrant a drive to investigate. The abandoned Sacred Heart Church stood at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by overgrown mesquite trees and prickly pear cacti. The white wooden structure, once the spiritual center of the small community, now bore the weathered scars of decades of neglect. Paint peeled from its walls like old skin, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had itself begun to warp and crack under the relentless Texas sun. David parked his truck and approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel and dried grass. The silence was absolute except for the distant call of a mockingbird and the whisper of wind through the surrounding brush. As he rounded the corner of the building, he stopped short. There, sitting on the front steps of the church, was unmistakably George Harvey Strait Sr. The 71-year-old country music legend sat with his head bowed, his signature cowboy hat resting beside him on the weathered wooden step. His silver hair caught the afternoon light, and his weathered hands were clasped together in front of him. He wore simple blue jeans and a plain white button-down shirt, looking more like a local rancher than one of the most successful recording artists in history. David hesitated, unsure whether to approach. This clearly wasn't a public appearance or scheduled event. George appeared to be in a moment of private reflection, possibly prayer. The journalist in David recognized a potentially significant story, but the human in him respected the apparent sanctity of the moment. The decision was made for him when George looked up, seeming to sense his presence. Their eyes met across the small churchyard, and for a moment neither man moved. Then George raised a hand in a small wave, not unfriendly but cautious. "Afternoon," George called out, his famous voice carrying easily across the still air. "Good afternoon, Mr. Strait," David replied, taking a few steps closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm David Mitchell from the Express-News. I hope I'm not intruding." George studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the step beside him. "You can call me George, and you're welcome to sit if you'd like, though I can't imagine what brings a reporter all the way out to this forgotten place." David approached slowly, noting the genuine weariness in the older man's voice. Up close, George looked every one of his years, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a slight stoop to his shoulders that spoke of carrying some invisible weight. "To be honest," David said, settling onto the step with a careful distance between them, "some folks in town mentioned they'd seen you here. I was curious about what might bring, well, someone of your stature to this particular spot." George smiled slightly, an expression that held more sadness than humor. "Someone of my stature," he repeated softly. "You know, that's part of the problem, isn't it? Sometimes a man just needs to be somewhere where he's not someone of stature. Sometimes he just needs to be a father who misses his child." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. David knew about the tragedy that had struck the Strait family in 1986, the car accident that claimed the life of George's 13-year-old daughter, Jennifer. It had been covered in the press at the time, though George had maintained strict privacy about his family's grief. "This church," George continued, looking up at the deteriorating structure behind them, "this is where Jennifer would have been confirmed if she'd lived long enough. We used to drive through here sometimes when she was little, and she always asked about this church, said it looked like something from a fairy tale, even though it was already starting to fall apart then." David felt the weight of the moment settling around them. This wasn't just a chance encounter with a celebrity, this was a deeply personal pilgrimage that George had been making in private, perhaps for years. "I don't usually talk to reporters about personal matters," George said, glancing at David, "but there's something about this place, about today. Maybe it's time some things were said out loud." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dried leaves of the mesquite trees and causing a loose board on the church to creak softly. David waited, sensing that whatever George was about to share would be significant. "People think they know about Jennifer's death," George said finally. "They know the basic facts, the accident, the funeral, how it changed our family, but what they don't know—" He paused, looking out across the empty landscape. "What they don't know is what she accomplished in her short life and what she's still accomplishing now, all these years later." David felt his pulse quicken. This was clearly more than just a grieving father's reminiscence. There was something deeper here, some untold story that George had kept private for decades. "What do you mean?" David asked gently. George turned to look at him directly, and in those weathered eyes, David saw a complex mix of grief, pride, and something else. A kind of determined secrecy that was finally ready to be unburdened. "I mean," George said slowly, "that Jennifer's legacy didn't end with her death. In fact, it might be the most important work I've ever been involved in, and almost nobody knows about it." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, its edges soft with handling. He held it for a moment, then passed it to David. The image showed a young girl with bright eyes and a radiant smile, sitting on a horse and wearing a cowboy hat that was slightly too big for her head. "That was taken about 6 months before she died," George said. "She was already showing signs of the kind of person she was going to become, compassionate, determined, always thinking about other people. The last thing she said to me—" He paused, his voice catching slightly. "The last thing she said was that she wanted to help other kids who were sick." David studied the photograph, seeing not just a pretty young girl, but something in her expression that suggested an unusual depth of character for someone so young. "She'd been volunteering at the Children's Hospital in San Antonio," George continued. "Even at 13, she understood that she was fortunate, healthy from a stable family, with opportunities that other kids didn't have. She wanted to do something about that." The mockingbird called again from somewhere in the mesquite, its song a lonely sound in the vast quiet of the rural landscape. David waited, sensing that George was building towards something significant. "After she died," George said, "Norma and I were devastated. For a long time we could barely function, let alone think about helping anyone else. But gradually, as we started to heal, we realized that the best way to honor Jennifer's memory wasn't just to mourn her, but to continue the work she had started." He gestured toward the abandoned church behind them. "This place became important to me because it represented something Jennifer believed in, that even forgotten, broken things could be made beautiful again with enough care and attention. She saw potential where other people saw decay." David felt the pieces of a larger story beginning to fall into place. "What kind of work are you talking about?" he asked. George smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. "That," he said, "is a much longer conversation. But since you've come all this way, and since this place seems to encourage truth-telling, I suppose it's time that story was told." He stood up from the church steps, his movements careful but determined. "Walk with me," he said. "There's something I want to show you inside." As they approached the weathered front door of the church, David realized that this abandoned building held secrets that went far beyond a famous man's private grief. Whatever George was about to reveal had been carefully guarded for decades, and the fact that he was choosing to share it now, in this forgotten place, suggested that the story was about to take an unexpected turn. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, and they stepped into the dim interior of Sacred Heart Church, where the afternoon light filtered through dirty windows, and the air held the musty smell of years of abandonment. But as David's eyes adjusted to the light, he began to see that this abandoned place wasn't quite as forgotten as it appeared from the outside. The interior of the church was a study in contrasts. While the exterior spoke of decades of neglect, someone had clearly been maintaining the inside with careful attention. The wooden pews were dust-free and arranged in neat rows. The altar area was clean, and fresh flowers, simple wildflowers that grew naturally in the Texas countryside, sat in mason jars on the windowsills. "You've been taking care of this place," David observed, running his hand along the smooth surface of a pew. George nodded, moving toward the front of the church where sunlight streamed through a stained glass window that, unlike the others, remained intact and brilliant. "For about 15 years now, I bought the property from the diocese when they were going to demolish it. They thought I was crazy, paying good money for a building that was ready to fall down. But Jennifer saw something here," David said, beginning to understand. "She did. And after she died, I couldn't shake the feeling that this place was important somehow." George stopped in front of the altar, where a simple wooden cross hung on the wall. "It took me years to figure out what I was supposed to do with it." He turned to face David, and there was an intensity in his expression that the journalist hadn't seen before. "What I'm about to tell you has to stay between us until I give you permission to write about it. There are too many people whose privacy and safety could be compromised if this story comes out the wrong way." David nodded, recognizing the gravity in George's voice. "You have my word." George reached into his back pocket and pulled out a key ring with several keys on it. He selected one and walked to what appeared to be a supply closet at the back of the church. When he opened the door, David was surprised to see not cleaning supplies, but a small office space with a desk, filing cabinets, and walls covered with photographs, letters, and certificates. "This," George said, "is the real reason I come here. Welcome to the headquarters of the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation." David stepped into the small space, overwhelmed by what he was seeing. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs of children, some in hospital beds, some at home, some playing and laughing despite obvious illness or disability. There were thank you letters written in crayon and childish handwriting, certificates of appreciation from hospitals and medical organizations, and newspaper clippings about various charitable events and donations. "How long has this been operating?" David asked, studying a particularly moving letter from a parent thanking someone for making their child's final months bearable. 37 years, George said quietly. "We established it 6 months after Jennifer died. At first, it was just Norma and me writing checks to the children's hospital where Jennifer had volunteered. But it grew from there." He pointed to a framed photograph on the desk, showing a young woman in a hospital gown, smiling while holding a guitar. "That's Sarah Martinez. She was 15 when we first met her, terminal leukemia, given maybe 6 months to live. Jennifer's foundation paid for experimental treatment that wasn't covered by her family's insurance. She's 31 now, married, with 2 kids of her own." David felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the scope of what he was seeing. "How many children have you helped?" George opened one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a thick ledger. "As of last month, we've provided direct assistance to 2,147 children and their families. Everything from medical expenses to housing during treatment to educational support for kids who miss school due to illness." The numbers were staggering. David quickly calculated that this represented millions of dollars in charitable giving, all done in complete secrecy. Why keep it quiet? Most celebrities use their charitable work for publicity. George's expression hardened slightly. Because the moment this becomes public, it stops being about the kids and starts being about me. Reporters would want to interview the families. Photographers would show up at hospitals. Sick children would become part of media stories they never asked to be part of. Jennifer hated the spotlight that came with being my daughter. She would never want other children to be subjected to that because of help that came from her foundation. He closed the ledger and returned it to the filing cabinet. Besides, the foundation works because people trust that we're discreet. Hospitals refer families to us because they know we won't exploit their patients for publicity. Social workers connect us with families because they know we're not looking for photo opportunities with sick kids. David nodded, beginning to understand the careful balance George had maintained for decades. But someone must know. You can't operate a foundation this size completely in secret. There are people who know, George acknowledged. Our attorney, Thomas Richardson, has handled the legal aspects from the beginning. Margaret Foster has been our primary liaison with hospitals and medical organizations for 20 years. A few select people at various hospitals who help us identify families in need. And Norma, of course, though the day-to-day operations have become mostly my responsibility since she started having health issues. He moved to another section of the wall where there were maps of Texas and other states with colored pins marking different locations. We've helped families in 43 states and 6 countries. Word spreads quietly through the medical community. Doctors and social workers who know about families facing catastrophic expenses or experimental treatments not covered by insurance. David studied the maps, trying to comprehend the network George had built. How do you decide who receives help? We don't, George said simply. We help everyone who comes to us, provided the need is genuine and the situation involves a child's health or well-being. Rich families, poor families, doesn't matter. Medical expenses can bankrupt anyone, and sick kids don't choose their parents' financial situation. He pulled out a manila folder and showed David a recent case file. This is the Peterson family from Dallas. Their 8-year-old daughter was born with a rare genetic condition that requires specialized treatment not available in Texas. The family needed help with travel and housing expenses to get her to a treatment center in Boston. We covered everything: flights, hotel, meals, even a rental car so they could explore the city with her between treatments. The file contained photos of a small girl with bright eyes and a brave smile, along with medical records, expense receipts, and a handwritten thank you note from her parents. David could see that every case was meticulously documented and personally managed. The hardest cases, George continued, are the ones where we can't save the child, but we can make their final time more comfortable for the whole family. We've paid for parents to take leave from work to spend time with dying children, covered funeral expenses, helped siblings get counseling. Jennifer understood that helping sick kids often means helping their entire families. David was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what he was learning. This wasn't just charitable giving. It was a comprehensive, sophisticated operation that had been changing lives for decades while remaining completely hidden from public view. The expenses must be enormous, he said finally. George nodded. The foundation has distributed about $42 million since it began operations. Most of that comes from my music earnings, but we've also had some substantial anonymous donations from other people over the years. People who learned about our work and wanted to contribute without publicity. $42 million. The figure hit David like a physical blow. This represented one of the most substantial private charitable operations he'd ever encountered, all inspired by a 13-year-old girl's desire to help sick children. There's more, George said. noting David's expression. "The foundation is just one part of what Jennifer's legacy has become. Come on, I want to show you something else." He led David out of the small office and back into the main part of the church. As they walked toward the altar, George pointed to details David had missed on first inspection. The pews, while old, had been carefully restored. The floor had been refinished. The stained glass window that provided the church's main light source had obviously been professionally repaired and maintained. "This church serves another purpose beyond housing our foundation records," George explained. "Once a month, we hold what we call Jennifer's Circle here. It's a support group for families who are dealing with childhood illness or who have lost children to disease or accidents." David looked around the sanctuary with new eyes, imagining it filled with families united by tragedy and hope. "How many people participate?" "It varies, but usually between 20 and 40 people. We provide childcare for healthy siblings, we bring in grief counselors and medical social workers, and we make sure there's always good food and a comfortable place for people to share their experiences without judgment." George walked to the altar and picked up a leather-bound book that rested there. "This is our memory book. Families write about their children, their personalities, their dreams, their brave moments, their struggles. It helps to put their experiences into words, and it helps other families know they're not alone." He opened the book and read quietly for a moment, then looked up at David. "Listen to this. Tommy loved baseball more than anything except maybe chocolate ice cream. Even when he was too weak from chemo to walk to the mailbox, he would lie in bed and listen to Rangers games on the radio, keeping statistics in a notebook he wrote in with hands that shook from the medication. He never complained about being sick, but he cried the day he realized he would probably never play Little League. The Jennifer Foundation didn't just pay for his treatment. They arranged for Nolan Ryan to visit him in the hospital and bring him a signed baseball. Tommy died 3 weeks later, but he died believing that dreams can come true, even when life is unfair. The words hung in the air of the small church, and David felt tears prick his eyes. This wasn't just charity. It was a profound understanding of what children and families needed during their most difficult times. "The families who come to Jennifer's Circle," George continued, "they understand each other in ways that other people can't. They've all faced the possibility or reality of losing a child, and they've all experienced the special kind of strength that children show when they're fighting for their lives. Jennifer would have wanted to be part of a community like this." David realized that George had created something far more complex and meaningful than a simple charitable foundation. He had built a network of support that addressed not just financial needs, but emotional and spiritual ones as well. "The secrecy," David said, "it's not just about privacy, it's about maintaining the integrity of what you've built." George nodded. "Exactly. The moment this becomes a George Strait story instead of a Jennifer Strait story, it changes the dynamic. Families start feeling like they owe me something or like they're part of my public image. The support group becomes complicated by celebrity instead of being focused on healing. The foundation becomes about my reputation instead of children's needs." He closed the memory book and returned it to its place on the altar. "But there's another reason I've kept this quiet for so long," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "and that's the part that's been eating at me for years, the part that maybe needs to come out now, even if it changes everything else." David felt his journalistic instincts heighten. This was the moment he had been sensing since their conversation began, the revelation that George had been building toward, the secret that had brought him to this abandoned church on a September afternoon. "What do you mean?" David asked. George walked to the front pew and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 71 years. "I mean that for 37 years, I've been living with the knowledge that Jennifer's death might not have been just a tragic accident. And if I'm right about what I think happened that night, then everything I've built in her memory has been my way of trying to make up for a mistake that can never be undone. The church fell silent except for the distant sound of wind through the mesquite trees outside. David waited, understanding that George was about to reveal something that had been buried for decades, something that went to the heart of not just Jennifer's death, but the extraordinary life George had lived in her memory. The silence in the church stretched between them like a physical presence. George sat in the front pew, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, staring at the simple wooden cross on the wall behind the altar. David remained standing, sensing that the next few moments would fundamentally change everything he thought he knew about this story. "The night Jennifer died," George began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was supposed to pick her up from her friend's house. She had called around 8 o'clock, asked if she could stay later to help with the school project. I told her that was fine, that I would come get her when she called." He paused, and David could see the effort it took for him to continue. "But I was tired. We had just finished a recording session that ran long, and I had been looking forward to a quiet evening at home. When Jennifer called back around 10:30 saying she was ready to come home, I made a decision that I've regretted every day since." George's voice cracked slightly. "I told her that her friend's older brother could drive her home. Michael Henderson was 16, had his license, seemed like a responsible kid. It was only about 15 minutes from their house to ours. It should have been simple." David felt his stomach tighten as he realized what was coming. The official reports of Jennifer's death had mentioned that she was a passenger in a car driven by a teenage family friend, but the focus had been on the accident itself. A rainy night, a curve taken too fast, a tree that couldn't be avoided. "Michael had been drinking," George continued. "Not a lot. He was under the legal limit when they tested him at the hospital, but enough that his reflexes were slowed, his judgment impaired. If I had gotten in my truck and driven those 15 minutes to pick up my daughter myself, she would be alive today." The words hung in the air like an indictment. David understood now why George had carried this burden for so long, why the foundation and the support group and all the work that followed had been necessary not just to honor Jennifer's memory, but to shoulder the crushing weight of paternal guilt. "George," David said gently, "you couldn't have known." George looked up at him with eyes that held decades of pain. "Couldn't I? Michael was 16 years old at a party on a Saturday night. What father doesn't consider the possibility that alcohol might be involved? But I was tired, and picking up my daughter felt like an inconvenience instead of a privilege." He stood up and began pacing in front of the altar, his movements agitated and restless. The Henderson family was devastated too. Michael survived the crash with minor injuries, but he was never the same. He attempted suicide twice in the months after the accident. Eventually, his family moved away from Texas, couldn't handle the guilt and the whispers and the constant reminders. David thought about the thousands of children who had been helped by the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation, the $42 million that had been quietly distributed to families in need, the monthly support groups that brought comfort to grieving parents. All of it built on the foundation of George's belief that he had failed his daughter when she needed him most. "The foundation," David said. "All of this work, it's not just about honoring Jennifer. It's about penance." George stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "At first, yes. For the first few years, everything we did was about trying to balance the scales somehow, trying to save other children because I couldn't save my own. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. It became about discovering what Jennifer would have done with her life if she had lived, and then doing it for her." He walked to the small office at the back of the church and returned with a different folder, this one much older and worn with handling. "These are Jennifer's papers from school, letters she wrote, projects she worked on." I've read them thousands of times, trying to understand who she was becoming and what kind of woman she would have been. He opened the folder and pulled out a composition paper written in careful 13-year-old handwriting. The title was "What I Want to Do When I Grow Up," and it was dated just 2 months before Jennifer's death. "Read this," George said, handing David the paper. David read aloud. "When I grow up, I want to be a doctor, but not the kind that works in an office seeing people with colds and broken arms. I want to work with children who have serious diseases like cancer or heart problems. I've been volunteering at the children's hospital, and I see how scared the kids are and how worried their parents get when they don't know if their insurance will pay for treatment or if they'll be able to take time off work to be with their child." He paused, struck by the maturity and compassion in the young girl's words. "Keep reading," George urged. "I think doctors should focus on making kids better, and someone else should focus on making sure their families don't have to worry about money or housing or their other children while they're going through treatment. Maybe someday I could start a foundation that helps families with all the things that hospitals can't help with. I would want it to be private, so families don't feel embarrassed about needing help, and I would want to help every child who needed it, not just the ones that would make good stories for newspapers." David looked up from the paper, stunned. "She wrote this when she was 13. George nodded, tears visible in his eyes. 2 months before she died. "When I found this paper among her school things after the funeral, I realized that the foundation wasn't my idea at all. It was hers. I was just the one left behind to make it happen." The implications hit David like a wave. Jennifer hadn't just inspired the foundation through her death. She had essentially designed it through her life. The emphasis on privacy, the comprehensive approach to helping families, the focus on children with serious medical needs, all of it had been outlined by a 13-year-old girl who understood suffering and wanted to alleviate it. "That's when my guilt started transforming into purpose," George continued. "I still carry the responsibility for her death. I always will. But I also carry the responsibility for her dreams. The foundation isn't just about my need to make amends. It's about her vision of what the world could be like for sick children and their families." He took the paper back from David and returned it carefully to the folder. "There's more. Jennifer had already started planning how such a foundation might work. She'd written letters to doctors at the children's hospital, asking about the most common problems families faced. She had researched other charitable organizations to see what they did and what gaps existed in services. George pulled out another document from the folder, a handwritten list in Jennifer's careful script. These are the services she thought a foundation should provide: medical expense assistance, housing and travel support for families during treatment, educational support for children who miss school, counseling services for the whole family, and what she called dignity preservation, making sure families could maintain their privacy and self-respect while receiving help. David studied the list, recognizing every service that the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation had been providing for 37 years. "She essentially wrote the blueprint for everything you've done." "She did. And that's why I've been so protective of keeping it private. This foundation exists exactly as Jennifer envisioned it, and I won't let publicity or my celebrity status corrupt her vision." But he trailed off, looking around the small church with an expression of deep uncertainty. "But," David prompted. George sighed deeply. "But I'm 71 years old. Norma's health is declining. The foundation needs to continue after we're gone, and that means eventually it will need to be public. The legal structure exists for it to operate independently, but without the secrecy I've maintained, I'm afraid it will become something Jennifer never intended." David began to understand why George had been willing to talk to him, why he had chosen this moment to reveal secrets he had guarded for nearly 4 decades. You need to tell the story now, while you can control how it's told. Maybe, George said. Or maybe I need to find another way. There are days when I think the foundation should die with me, that publicizing it would dishonor Jennifer's memory. But then I think about all the children who could be helped in the future, and I know she wouldn't want her death to limit the scope of helping other kids. He walked to the stained glass window and stood in the colored light it cast across the altar area. The truth is, David, I've been coming to this church for months, trying to figure out what to do. This place helps me think clearly, helps me feel close to Jennifer in a way that's different from anywhere else. What makes this place special? David asked. George smiled for the first time since he had begun telling this story. Because this is where Jennifer first told me about her ideas for helping sick children. We stopped here one Sunday afternoon when she was about 11, just to look at the building because she thought it was pretty. We sat on those front steps, and she told me about a little boy she had met at the hospital who was afraid he was going to die because his parents kept crying whenever they talked to the doctors. He turned back to David. Jennifer said she wanted to find a way to help families be stronger during medical crises, so children wouldn't have to worry about their parents on top of worrying about being sick. She said if kids knew their families were taken care of, they could focus their energy on getting better instead of taking care of everyone else. The depth of understanding that Jennifer had possessed at such a young age was remarkable, but David was beginning to see that her wisdom had been forged by direct experience with suffering. Her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital hadn't been casual charity, it had been serious preparation for a life dedicated to service. The accident, David said carefully. Have you ever talked to Michael Henderson about what happened that night? George's expression grew pained. Not directly, but I've kept track of him over the years. After his family moved away, he struggled for a long time, dropped out of college, had problems with alcohol and depression. But about 10 years ago, he got sober and started working as a counselor for teenagers dealing with addiction and trauma. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Michael doesn't know about the foundation, but he's dedicated his adult life to preventing other young people from making the kinds of mistakes that cost Jennifer her life. In his own way, he's been honoring her memory too. David felt the pieces of a complex story clicking into place. This wasn't just about one man's guilt or one girl's death. It was about how tragedy can ripple outward, creating waves of both destruction and healing that continue for decades. Have you ever thought about reconnecting with him? David asked. George was quiet for a long time, staring out through the stained glass window at the Texas landscape beyond. I've thought about it, he said finally. There have been times when I've wanted to tell him that I don't blame him, that the responsibility was mine for putting him in that situation, but I've also been afraid that opening that door might cause him more pain than healing. Or it might give both of you some peace, David suggested gently. George nodded slowly. Maybe that's part of what I need to figure out before I decide what to do about the foundation going public. Maybe some secrets have been kept too long, even when they were kept for good reasons. He looked at David with an expression that was both determined and vulnerable. If I were to tell this story publicly, if I were to let the world know about Jennifer's foundation and her dreams and what happened the night she died, would you be willing to help me tell it the right way? David felt the weight of the request. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a trust, a sacred responsibility to honor the memory of a remarkable young girl and the extraordinary work that had grown from her vision. I would be honored, David said, but only if you're certain it's what you want to do. Once this story is out there, there's no taking it back. George sat back down in the front pew and was quiet for several minutes, his gaze moving from the cross on the wall to the photographs of children that covered the walls of the small office, to the memory book that held the stories of families who had found strength in sharing their experiences. Jennifer believed that helping people required courage, he said finally. Maybe it's time I showed the same kind of courage she did. The decision, once made, seemed to energize George in a way that surprised David. Over the next hour, as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening, George shared details about the Foundation's operations that revealed the sophisticated network he had built over nearly 4 decades. The logistics alone are extraordinary, David marveled, as George showed him thick binders of case files, financial records, and correspondence with medical facilities across the country. How have you managed to coordinate all of this while maintaining your music career? George smiled, and for the first time it was the expression of a man who was proud of his work rather than burdened by it. It helps that country music and charitable work operate on similar principles. You show up, you do your best, you treat people with respect, and you don't make it about yourself unless absolutely necessary. He pulled out a calendar that showed a complex schedule of recording sessions, concert dates, and what appeared to be foundation-related activities. Most people think I spend my time off touring or recording, just relaxing at the ranch, but probably 60% of my free time is spent on foundation work, reviewing cases, visiting hospitals, meeting with families, coordinating with our medical partners. David studied the calendar, noting entries like Dallas Children's Thompson family, conference call with Dr. Sarah Martinez cardiac program, and Jennifer's Circle monthly meeting. The scope of George's personal involvement was far greater than he had imagined. You meet with the families personally, David asked. When possible, and when they want to meet. Many prefer to maintain their privacy, and we respect that completely. But some families find it meaningful to know that their help is coming from someone who understands loss. I'm not a grief counselor or a medical expert, but I am a father who has buried a child, and sometimes that shared experience matters. George walked to a different section of the small office and pulled out a photo album. These are some of the families I've been privileged to meet over the years. Each one has taught me something about courage, about love, about what really matters in life. He opened the album to a page showing a picture of George sitting in a hospital room with a young boy who was clearly undergoing chemotherapy treatment. The boy was wearing a cowboy hat, George's cowboy hat, and both were smiling despite the clinical setting. That's Marcus Williams, George said. 8 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. His parents had exhausted their savings and were facing bankruptcy trying to pay for his treatment. The foundation covered his medical expenses, but when I met Marcus, he told me his biggest worry wasn't about being sick. It was that his dad had to work 3 jobs to try to pay the hospital bills and never had time to play with him anymore. George turned the page to show another photo of the same boy, this time at what appeared to be a baseball game, sitting with a man who must have been his father. We helped his dad take a leave of absence from 2 of his jobs so he could spend time with Marcus during treatment. Marcus has been in remission for 6 years now, and he still sends me a Christmas card every year. David was struck by the personal attention George gave to each case. This wasn't just institutional charity, it was individual care extended to families during their most vulnerable moments. The hardest part, George continued, is when we can't save them, when the treatment doesn't work, when the diagnosis is too late, when medicine just isn't enough. Those are the families that need us most because they're facing not just medical bills, but funeral expenses, grief counseling, and the need to help siblings understand why their brother or sister died. He turned to a page that showed George at what was clearly a funeral, standing with a family beside a small casket. That's the Morrison family. Their daughter Emma was 7, when she was diagnosed with brain cancer. We supported them through 8 months of treatment, but eventually it became clear that Emma wasn't going to survive. George's voice became softer. Emma's last wish was to have a party for all the children in the pediatric ward at her hospital. Not a sad goodbye, but a celebration where kids could forget about being sick for a few hours. The foundation organized the whole thing. Magicians, face painters, a petting zoo, more toys than you could imagine. He pointed to another photo showing a room full of children, some in wheelchairs, some with IV poles, all laughing and playing with animals from the petting zoo. Emma died 3 days after that party, but her parents told me later that seeing those other children happy was what gave Emma peace about leaving. She knew she had made a difference for other kids, just like she had always wanted to do. David felt the emotional weight of these stories accumulating. Each case represented not just financial assistance, but profound human connection during moments of crisis and loss. The foundation, David said, it's not really about the money, is it? It's about dignity and hope and human connection. George nodded emphatically. Exactly. Jennifer understood that when families are facing a child's serious illness, the practical problems, money, housing, work schedules, become overwhelming and prevent them from focusing on what really matters, which is being present for their child. By taking care of the practical issues, we free families to love each other through the crisis. He closed the photo album and returned it to its place on the shelf. But there's another aspect of this work that's been equally important to me personally. It's given me a way to stay connected to Jennifer, to feel like I'm still her father in some meaningful way. David looked around the small office, seeing it now as more than just a headquarters for charitable work. It was a shrine to ongoing parenthood, a place where George could continue to nurture and protect children in honor of the daughter he couldn't save. "Tell me about Jennifer's Circle," David said. "How did that develop?" George's expression brightened. "That started about 12 years ago, when I realized that many of the families we had helped stayed in touch with each other. They had formed their own informal support network, calling each other during difficult times, sharing resources and encouragement. I thought they might benefit from having a regular place to meet." He led David back into the main sanctuary of the church, which looked different now that David understood its purpose. The carefully arranged pews, the comfortable lighting, the memory book on the altar. Everything was designed to facilitate sharing and healing. "We meet on the 3rd Saturday of every month. Sometimes we have guest speakers, doctors, social workers, grief counselors. Sometimes we just talk. Always we remember the children we've lost and celebrate the children who are surviving." George walked to a wooden box sitting on a table near the altar. "This is our prayer and wish box. Families write down their hopes, their fears, their requests for support. We don't necessarily answer them in a religious sense, but we make sure that every practical need that gets expressed finds some kind of response." He opened the box and pulled out a few folded pieces of paper. "Can I read you some of these? These families have given permission for their words to be shared." David nodded, and George unfolded the first paper. This one says, "My son David is starting his 2nd round of chemo next week. I'm scared about how sick it will make him, but I'm more scared about missing work to take care of him. Please pray that we can figure out how to manage everything." We helped David's family with rent and groceries, so his mother could take family leave without losing their apartment. He opened another paper. This one. "Sarah's treatment is working, and the doctors think she'll be able to start school again in the fall. We're so grateful for all the help we've received, and we want to find a way to help other families going through what we went through. Sarah's parents now volunteer with us, helping new families navigate the medical system." The papers represented a cycle of healing that extended far beyond individual cases. Families who had been helped often found ways to help others, creating a community of support that was self-sustaining and constantly growing. The most powerful part of Jennifer's circle, George said, is watching families realize they're not alone. Medical crises can be incredibly isolating, especially when financial stress is involved. Families often feel ashamed about needing help, guilty about the impact on their other children, and overwhelmed by navigating complex medical and insurance systems. He gestured toward the pews. But when they sit here with other families who have faced similar challenges, that isolation breaks down. Parents share practical advice about dealing with insurance companies. Siblings talk about what it's like when a brother or sister is sick. And children who are patients themselves connect with other kids who understand what treatment feels like. David could imagine the scene. Families gathered in this simple church, sharing their fears and hopes with people who truly understood their experiences. It was the kind of healing that couldn't be purchased with charitable donations, but emerged from genuine human connection. "Has the circle helped you heal?" David asked. George was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "It's helped me understand that grief doesn't end, but it can transform into something purposeful. Every month, I sit with parents who are where Norma and I were 37 years ago, devastated, frightened, feeling like the world has become an unsafe place for their children." He sat down in one of the pews and looked toward the altar. "But I also see families who have made it through their crisis stronger than before, children who have survived and thrived, parents who have discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. It reminds me that while Jennifer's death was a tragedy, the work that has grown from it has created something genuinely beautiful." David joined him in the pew, feeling the weight of the day's revelations settling around them. "What happens now? If you decide to go public with this story, how do you protect what you've built while expanding its reach?" George sighed deeply. "That's the question that brought me here today. I've been thinking about it for months, and I still don't have a clear answer. On one hand, public awareness could bring in additional funding and help us reach more families. On the other hand, it could fundamentally change the character of what we do." He looked at David directly. Jennifer wrote in one of her school papers that the best kind of help is the kind that lets people maintain their dignity. "I'm afraid that publicity could make families feel like their private struggles have become part of someone else's public story." "But," David said carefully, "keeping it completely private also limits how many people you can help. There must be thousands of families who could benefit from the Foundation's support, but don't know it exists." George nodded. "That's exactly the dilemma. Jennifer would want us to help as many children as possible, but she would also want each family to receive help in a way that honored their privacy and autonomy." They sat in silence for several minutes, each contemplating the complexity of the decision. Finally, George spoke again. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said. "Something that might influence how this story gets told." David felt his attention sharpen. Throughout their conversation, he had sensed that George was building towards something, some final revelation that would complete the picture of what the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation had become. "What is it?" David asked. George stood up and walked to the small office, returning with a different folder than any he had shown before. This one was labeled Future Plans and appeared to contain architectural drawings and legal documents. "Jennifer's foundation has grown beyond what any of us imagined when it started," George said. "The monthly support groups, the individual family assistance, the network of medical professionals who refer cases to us. It's become a model for how comprehensive family support during medical crises should work." He opened the folder and showed David detailed architectural plans for what appeared to be a large residential facility. "This is the Jennifer Lynn Strait Family Center. We've been planning it for 3 years, and construction is set to begin next spring." David studied the drawings, seeing a complex of buildings that included housing units, medical consultation rooms, educational facilities, and recreational areas. What exactly is this? It's a place where families can stay while their children are receiving treatment at major medical centers, George explained. Free housing, on-site childcare for siblings, tutoring for children who are missing school, counseling services, and coordination with hospital social workers. Everything Jennifer envisioned, but in a permanent professional facility. The scope of the project was breathtaking. David could see that this represented millions of dollars in construction and ongoing operational costs. The center will be built in San Antonio, close to both the Children's Hospital and the Cancer Treatment Center. George continued, it will serve families from across the Southwest who have to travel for their children's medical care. David realized that this changed everything about the decision to go public. This is why you're considering telling the story now. A facility this size can't be kept secret. George nodded. Exactly. Once the center opens, the foundation will necessarily become more visible. Families will know where their help is coming from. Medical professionals will see our work directly, and the media will inevitably take notice. He closed the folder and looked around the small church that had served as the foundation's hidden headquarters for so many years. This place has been perfect for what we've done so far, intimate, private, focused on individual relationships. But the center represents the next phase of Jennifer's vision, and that phase requires a different kind of transparency. So the question isn't really whether to go public, David said, understanding. It's how to go public in a way that honors everything the foundation has been while preparing for what it's going to become. George smiled, and David could see relief in his expression. You understand perfectly. I need to tell this story now, while I can still control how it's told, so that when the center opens and the foundation's work becomes visible, people will understand the values and principles that have guided us from the beginning. David felt the magnitude of the responsibility George was offering him. This wasn't just a human interest story about a celebrity's charitable work. It was the public introduction of what could become one of the most significant family support organizations in the country. When do you want to do this? David asked. George looked at his watch, noting that the sun was beginning to set outside the church windows. Soon, within the next few weeks. But first, there's one more thing I need to do, one more person I need to talk to before this story can be complete. Michael Henderson? David guessed. George nodded. It's time I had that conversation I've been avoiding for 37 years. If I'm going to tell the world about Jennifer's legacy, I owe it to him to hear the truth about that night, directly from me, not from a newspaper article. As they prepared to leave the church, David looked around one more time at the small sanctuary that had served as the secret heart of an extraordinary charitable operation. Tomorrow, George would begin the process of bringing this hidden work into the light, and the simple church would become a pilgrimage site for families seeking the kind of comprehensive support that Jennifer Strait had envisioned decades before. But tonight, it remained what it had always been, a place where a grieving father could feel close to his daughter and continue the work of healing that had grown from tragedy into hope. 3 weeks later, David found himself sitting in a coffee shop in Austin, watching the door and waiting for a man he had never met, but whose story had become intertwined with everything he had learned about George Strait and the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation. Michael Henderson had agreed to meet with David, but only after George had called him personally to explain what was about to happen. That conversation between George and Michael had taken place 5 days earlier, in a restaurant in Houston, where Michael now worked as a substance abuse counselor. According to George, it had been one of the most difficult and important conversations of his life. He's not the same person he was at 16, George had told David afterward. He spent his adult life trying to make amends for what happened that night, just like I have. But he's been carrying the additional burden of knowing that he was the one behind the wheel. Now, as David waited for Michael to arrive, he reflected on how much his understanding of this story had evolved since that September afternoon in the abandoned church. What had begun as a simple investigation into a celebrity sighting had become something far more complex, a story about guilt and forgiveness, about how tragedy can be transformed into purpose, and about the ways that private grief can become public healing. The coffee shop door opened, and David recognized Michael Henderson immediately from the photograph George had shown him. At 53, Michael was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard-won wisdom. He carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to be conscious of his impact on others. "David Mitchell?" Michael asked, approaching the table where David sat. "Yes, thank you for agreeing to meet," David replied, standing to shake hands. Michael slid into the booth across from David and ordered coffee from the waitress, who appeared almost immediately. For a few moments, they sat in the kind of awkward silence that precedes difficult conversations. "George told me you're writing about Jennifer's foundation," Michael said finally. "I have to admit, when he called me last week, it was the first time we'd spoken since the funeral. I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation." "But you had it anyway," David observed. Michael nodded, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. 37 years is a long time to carry a secret. When George told me about all the work he's been doing in Jennifer's memory, all the children who've been helped because of what happened that night, it changed how I think about everything. David waited, sensing that Michael needed to find his own way into this story. "I need you to understand something," Michael continued. "I wasn't drunk that night. I had a couple of beers at the party, but I was well below the legal limit. That was never the issue. The issue was that I was 16 years old, overconfident, and showing off for a girl I was trying to impress." He paused, looking out the window at the Austin traffic. "Jennifer was in the back seat with my friend's little sister. They were talking about some school project, completely innocent conversation. I was driving too fast because I wanted to seem cool, and when we hit that curve on Farm Road 1518, I lost control." David had read the accident report, but hearing the details from Michael's perspective made the tragedy feel immediate and real in a way that official documents couldn't convey. "The car rolled twice before hitting the tree," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The two girls in the back took the worst of it. Jennifer was killed instantly, at least that's what the doctors told us. My friend's sister Amy was in a coma for 3 weeks, but eventually recovered completely." "And you?" David asked gently. "Broken arm, concussion, some cuts from the glass. Nothing that mattered compared to what happened to Jennifer." Michael's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I remember waking up in the hospital and asking about everyone else. When they told me Jennifer was dead, I wanted to die too." David could see the weight that Michael still carried, the way his shoulders curved slightly inward, as if he were still protecting himself from an impact that had happened decades earlier. "George told me he's never blamed you for what happened," David said. Michael looked up with an expression of surprise and pain. "That's what he said when we talked last week. But for 37 years, I've been living with the knowledge that I killed George Strait's daughter. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" The question hung in the air between them. David could see that Michael's entire adult life had been shaped by this moment of teenage recklessness, just as George's had been shaped by his decision not to pick up Jennifer himself. "Tell me about what happened after the accident," David said. Michael sighed deeply. "My family was devastated, but they were also protective. They got me the best lawyers, made sure I wasn't charged criminally since I wasn't legally intoxicated. But the guilt was worse than any punishment the courts could have given me." He described the months that followed, The funeral he wasn't invited to, the hatred from some community members who felt he had gotten away with murder, the depression that eventually led to 2 suicide attempts. I dropped out of high school, couldn't handle being around the other kids. Some of them were sympathetic, but others made it clear that they thought I was a killer who had escaped justice. My parents eventually decided we needed to leave Texas entirely. Michael's family had moved to Colorado, where he spent several years drifting through various jobs and struggling with alcohol abuse. I wasn't drinking and driving, he said, but I was drinking to forget. For about 10 years, I was pretty much a mess. What changed? David asked. Michael smiled slightly, the first positive expression David had seen from him. I met a woman named Sarah Martinez, not the same Sarah that George mentioned, different person entirely. She was a counselor at a treatment center where I finally ended up when my drinking got out of control. He described how Sarah had helped him understand that his guilt, while justified, was destroying his ability to honor Jennifer's memory in any meaningful way. She told me that if I really wanted to make amends for what I had done, I needed to find a way to prevent other young people from making similar mistakes. So you became a counselor yourself? Eventually, yes. But first, I had to get sober, finish my education, and figure out how to turn my experience into something useful for other people. Michael had gone back to school, earned a degree in psychology, and specialized in working with teenagers dealing with trauma and addiction. For the last 15 years, I've been working with kids who are where I was at 16, making dangerous decisions because they don't understand consequences or dealing with the aftermath of mistakes that change their lives forever. David was struck by the parallel between Michael's work and George's foundation. Both men had found ways to transform their guilt over Jennifer's death into service to others, though neither had known about the other's efforts until the previous week. When George told you about the foundation, David said, how did that change things for you? Michael was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he had been asking for decades. It was overwhelming, he said finally. To learn that Jennifer's death had inspired something so beautiful, so helpful to so many people, it made me realize that while I took her life, George had found a way to extend it. He looked up at David with tears in his eyes. For 37 years, I've been focused on the fact that Jennifer died because of my mistake. But talking to George made me understand that Jennifer's influence didn't end that night. In some ways, her death became the beginning of a different kind of life, one that has touched thousands of families. David felt the emotional weight of what Michael was expressing. The foundation hadn't just helped other children, it had given new meaning to Jennifer's death for everyone who had been affected by it. George invited me to visit the church where he does his foundation work, Michael continued. He showed me all the pictures of children who have been helped, all the letters from families, all the documentation of what Jennifer's vision has become. Michael pulled out his phone and showed David a photograph. It was a picture of George and Michael standing together in front of the Sacred Heart Church, both men looking older and sadder than they should have, but also somehow peaceful. He told me something that I don't think I'll ever forget, Michael said. He said that Jennifer would have forgiven me immediately, and that she would have wanted me to forgive myself so I could help other kids avoid making similar mistakes. Do you believe that? David asked. Michael nodded slowly. I'm starting to, and that's why I'm willing to talk to you about this. If George is going to tell the world about Jennifer's foundation, then the world deserves to know the whole truth about how it started, including the part about my responsibility for her death. David realized that Michael's willingness to speak publicly about the accident would add a crucial dimension to the story. It would show that the foundation wasn't just about George's guilt, but about a community of people who had been affected by Jennifer's death and found ways to honor her memory. "What do you want people to know?" David asked. Michael considered the question carefully. "I want them to know that teenage mistakes can have permanent consequences, but that those consequences don't have to define the rest of your life. I want them to know that forgiveness, both giving it and receiving it, is possible even in the most tragic circumstances." He paused, then continued, And I want them to know that Jennifer Strait was the kind of person who would have wanted her death to inspire healing rather than hatred. Everything George has built in her memory reflects who she really was." As their conversation drew to a close, Michael shared one final piece of information that surprised David. "George has asked me to speak at the grand opening of the family center next year. He wants me to tell my story to the families who will be using the facility, so they understand that the support they're receiving came from the deepest kind of loss, but was built with love." David could see the healing that had occurred in both men through their recent reconciliation. The guilt they had both carried for decades hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into a shared commitment to honoring Jennifer's memory through service to others. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Michael had one more thing to say. "When your article comes out, there will probably be people who think George should have prosecuted me more aggressively, or who think I shouldn't be allowed to work with children because of what happened. I understand that, and I'm prepared for it. But," David prompted, "but I also know that Jennifer would have wanted her death to create more healing than hatred. The foundation proves that's exactly what happened. If people can understand that, then maybe they can understand that redemption is possible for everyone involved in a tragedy, not just the victims." 2 days later, David sat in his office at the San Antonio Express-News, staring at his computer screen and the blank document that would become the most important story of his career. He had interviewed George multiple times since their initial meeting at the church, spoken with several families who had been helped by the foundation, talked to medical professionals who worked with the organization, and spent hours reviewing financial documents and case files. The story he was about to write would reveal the existence of one of the most significant private charitable operations in the country. It would introduce the world to Jennifer Strait's remarkable vision and the extraordinary network of support that had grown from her 13-year-old dreams of helping sick children. But more than that, it would tell a story about how tragedy can be transformed into healing, how guilt can become purpose, and how a father's love for his daughter can create a legacy that touches thousands of lives. David began typing, and the words came easily, as if Jennifer herself were guiding his hands across the keyboard. Epilogue. 6 months later, the Jennifer Lynn Strait Family Center opened on a bright spring morning in San Antonio, exactly 38 years after Jennifer's death. The sprawling complex of buildings could house up to 50 families at a time, providing them with free accommodation, child care, educational support and counseling services, while their children received medical treatment at nearby hospitals. George Strait stood at the podium during the dedication ceremony, looking out at an audience that included families who had been helped by the foundation, medical professionals who had worked with the organization for years, and hundreds of people who had learned about Jennifer's story through David's newspaper series. "My daughter Jennifer died when she was 13 years old," George said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But her dreams didn't die with her. Today, we're opening a facility that represents everything she hoped to accomplish, a place where families can focus on loving each other through medical crises while other people take care of the practical problems that would otherwise overwhelm them." In the audience, Michael Henderson sat with his wife and teenage daughter, no longer hiding from his past, but using it to help others understand the power of redemption and forgiveness. Near the front, families who were currently staying at the center listened as George described the services that would be available to them. Not just housing and food, but tutoring for healthy siblings, play therapy for children undergoing treatment, support groups for parents, and coordination with hospital social workers to ensure that every family's needs were met. Jennifer believed that helping people required courage, George concluded. She showed that courage in her 13 years of life, and I hope that this center will give other families the courage they need to face whatever challenges come their way. As the ribbon was cut and families began touring their new temporary home, David watched from the back of the crowd, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The story he had written about the foundation had been picked up by national media, bringing in additional donations and volunteers from across the country. But more importantly, it had inspired other communities to develop similar programs, creating a network of family support centers that extended Jennifer's vision far beyond what even George had imagined possible. The abandoned church in Pearsall still served as the headquarters for Jennifer's Circle, where families continued to meet monthly to share their experiences and support each other through medical crises. But now it was just one part of a much larger operation that included the Family Center, a scholarship program for children affected by serious illness, and a training institute that taught other organizations how to develop comprehensive family support programs. As David prepared to leave the dedication ceremony, a young girl approached him, one of the children currently staying at the center while undergoing cancer treatment. She handed him a drawing she had made, showing a building surrounded by people holding hands. "My mom told me you're the one who wrote about Jennifer," the girl said. "I wanted to give you this picture to say thank you for helping people know about this place." David looked at the drawing, seeing in the child's simple artwork the same vision of community and healing that Jennifer Strait had possessed decades earlier. The girl's cancer treatment would continue for several more months, but her family would face that challenge with housing, childcare, and emotional support that would allow them to focus on what really mattered, being together during a difficult time. "What's your name?" David asked the girl. "Jennifer," she replied with a smile that reminded him powerfully of the photograph George had shown him that first day at the church. "My mum says I was named after someone very special." As David drove home that evening, he thought about the extraordinary legacy that had grown from one family's tragedy. Jennifer Strait had lived only 13 years, but her vision of comprehensive support for families facing medical crises had now touched thousands of lives and would continue to do so for generations to come. The foundation that bore her name had become more than just a charitable organization. It was a testament to the power of love to transform loss into healing, and a reminder that even the most devastating tragedies can become the seeds of hope for others facing similar challenges. In the end, David realized, this had never really been a story about George Strait, or even about the remarkable foundation he had built. It had been a story about Jennifer, about the kind of person she was, the dreams she had nurtured, and the legacy that continued to grow from the love her family felt for her. That love had created something beautiful and lasting, something that honored not just Jennifer's memory, but her vision of a world where sick children and their families would never have to face their challenges alone. And in that vision made real, Jennifer Strait had achieved the kind of immortality that only comes from touching other people's lives with compassion and hope.